Montana Territory, June 1874. The train hissed into the station like it hated to stop, but Georgia Mae Mercer stood firm on the dusty platform, her carpetbag clutched tight, her heart pounding harder than it had on her wedding day. She had sold her wedding ring 4 days ago in a pawn shop in Springfield, Illinois. The man behind the counter had squinted at the gold band, turned it over in his thick fingers, and said, "This'll get you 1 ticket west." Not much more. It had been enough. Barely. She had not even looked back. Now, she was here, bitter wind in her face, strangers all around, the Rockies like a jagged promise in the distance. She had no husband, no children, no home. Only questions she was not ready to answer, and a worn pair of boots carrying her further from everything she had once believed in. The station was little more than a shack with a crooked sign that read "Bitter Horn." A freight wagon rattled by, and she stepped aside, blinking through the dust. "Ma'am?" A voice called from behind her. She turned. The cowboy on horseback was dismounting slow, like he had all the time in the world. Tall, lean, dressed in a worn duster and dust-covered boots. His hat shaded most of his face, but when he looked up, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds. Serious eyes. "Steady. You Georgia Mercer?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes." "Who's asking?" "Name's Vaughn Silvers. Your cousin Ruth wrote me. Said you were coming west, needed work. I run a cattle spread north of here. We could use another hand in the kitchen. You ever cook for 20 men before?" "No," Georgia said, her voice dry from train smoke and nerves, "but I can learn. I do not need charity. I will earn every penny." One corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. "Not quite anything." "Good. I do not hand out anything for free." He helped her load her bag into the wagon hitched just outside the station. She climbed up beside him, stiff in the seat, her spine straight as a fence post. He did not speak much, just clucked to the horses and drove north. The land stretched wide around them, golden grass, low rolling hills, the horizon endless. Georgia stole glances at him when he was not looking. His face was sun-darkened, jaw tight. A scar curved beneath his left cheekbone, half hidden by stubble. "Not young. Maybe 30. Maybe more." "What happened to your husband?" he asked suddenly. She looked straight ahead. "He died." "Sorry to hear it." She did not answer, because that was not quite true. Not the way he thought. Her husband had died to her long before the fever took him. Long before he had gambled away their savings and cursed her for not giving him a son. There had been no funeral tears. Only silence. They reached the ranch just before sundown. The house was a low-built thing, but sturdy, with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. A weathered barn stood nearby, flanked by corrals and fencing in need of repair. Men moved across the yard, ranch hands, muddy and tired, heading toward the cookhouse. Georgia stepped down and stared. It was not much, but it was something. "I will show you where you sleep," Vaughn said. "Then tomorrow you meet the others and get started." She nodded, following him inside. The next few days passed in a blur of flour, firewood, and aching arms. Georgia rose before the sun, cooked through the morning, scrubbed pans, baked bread, boiled coffee, then did it again at supper. No one treated her poorly, but no one spoke much either, except Vaughn. He came in late, always quiet, always watching. He ate in silence, then helped gather plates, never asked for thanks. Sometimes he would pause by the doorway, looking out at the dusk like it was speaking to him. One night, after the men had gone to bed and the fire was low, he lingered. "You are learning fast," he said. "I have to. I do not plan to be anyone's burden." "You are not." She stared at him. "You do not know me." "I know enough." He looked straight at her, voice even. "I know you ran from something. And I know you are not running now." Her throat tightened. "Why did you offer to help me?" "Ruth said she had not seen you in years. She was kind to me once. Fed me when I was 16 and half-starved. Told me kindness matters more than pride." He paused. Figured it was time I listened. Georgia turned away, blinking hard. She had not cried since the night she left Illinois. She would not start now. But the days rolled on and Vaughn kept showing up in small ways. A quiet nod when she burned the biscuits. A steadying hand when she tripped carrying water. Once he handed her a scarf as the wind picked up, just placed it in her hands without a word. And one afternoon, as she hung laundry behind the cookhouse, she found a small box tucked inside her apron. She opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple gold. No stone. No flourish. But it gleamed in the sunlight like a promise. She spun around, heart-thudding. Vaughn stood by the fence, arms crossed, watching her. "I do not understand," she said, holding the box tight. Why would you give me this?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Because the one you sold was for the wrong man. And I figure you deserve one that means something real." George's breath hitched. I do not know what to say." "Say you will stay," he said. "Say you will let me try." She looked up at him, her heart turning over. "I want to," she whispered. He reached out, brushing a curl from her cheek. His fingers were rough, but the touch made her knees weak. "I know what it feels like to not be wanted," he said. "But Georgia, I want you." She stepped into him, her head against his chest. "I want you too." And in the wind that afternoon, behind a cookhouse on a ranch far from anything she had ever known, Georgia felt something crack open inside her. Not fear, not regret, but hope. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe in tomorrow. Georgia woke to the scent of dew-wet earth and the hush of a morning not yet stirred. Pale light leaked through the crack in the shutters. She sat up slowly, her body reminding her of the long hours spent hauling water and kneading dough. But her chest felt lighter than it had in years. She dressed in silence, hands steady as she pinned her hair and buttoned her blouse. The small ring Vaughn had given her rested on the nightstand, its band catching the faint light like a quiet vow. She touched it once, just once, before slipping it into her apron pocket and heading out. The yard was still, save for the horses shifting in their stalls and the wind teasing the tall grass. Vaughn stood near the corral, sleeves rolled to his elbows, mending a warped gate hinge. He looked up as she approached, then returned to his work without a word. She didn't mind. She crossed to the cookhouse and stoked the stove, her movements practiced now. As the fire caught, she glanced through the open window and caught sight of a bay mare pacing the far end of the pasture. It limped slightly. "You've got one favoring her back leg," she said later, catching Vaughn between fence posts and saddles. "That mare's been off since the thaw," he replied, pushing his hat back with the crook of his wrist. "Doc Carter's due next week, but I'm not partial to waiting that long." "Want me to take a look?" she asked, brushing her hands on her skirt. "My father bred horses before the war. Taught me some." He studied her for a breath. "You know how to check a hoof for bruising?" "Well enough." They walked the pasture together, not speaking until they reached the mare. Georgia moved slow, her voice even as she stroked the animal's neck and eased down to the fetlock. Vaughn crouched nearby, watching. "Stone bruise," she said after a moment, lifting the hoof to show him. "She stepped wrong somewhere muddy. Needs rest and soaking. I'll fill the trough. You stay with her." He returned with a bucket, and together they cooled the leg with water from the pump. The mare calmed under George's hand, her ears twitching with trust. Vaughn stood beside her, sleeves still damp, his expression unreadable. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, his voice almost lost in the wind. "No," she said. "That place turned hollow long before I left. There's nothing waiting for me back there but memories that don't sit right." He nodded once, then looked away toward the mountains, their ridges sharp against the sky. "I buried someone once," he said. "Not from sickness or war. She just stopped waking up one winter. Never said goodbye. Just gone." His jaw tensed. "I didn't speak to anyone for half a year." Georgia didn't reach for him. She just stood close, letting the silence between them settle like dust after rain. "Some holes don't fill," he added, "but you learn to build around them." Her fingers brushed his briefly. "I'm not trying to fill anything, just trying to stand on my own feet." "You are," he said, meeting her gaze. "But you don't have to do it alone." Later that evening, after supper and dishes and the last of the wood had been split, Georgia walked out to the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and horses. Vaughn sat on the steps, carving a piece of cedar with his pocket knife. The curls of wood gathered at his feet. She sank beside him without a word. "Used to carve things for the younger hands," he said. "Keeps my hands busy when the day's done." "What are you making now?" He held up the beginnings of a bird ruff, unfinished. "Nothing yet. Just shaping." She leaned back against the post, watching the stars blink into place. "I don't need a new ring to know where I stand," she said softly. "I know." It wasn't about needing. It was about wanting. She looked at him then, and for the first time, she saw something not just steady in him but tender. Not just quiet, but waiting. "I want to stay," she said at last. "Not just here. With you." He didn't answer in words. He set the cedar bird down and reached for her hand. The touch was warm, calloused, sure. The stillness between them wasn't empty now. It was full of breath, of promise, of something just beginning. And when she laid her head against his shoulder, he let his cheek rest lightly atop her hair. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The wind moved around them, gentle and unhurried, and the stars held. The first hard frost came early that year. By the second week of September, the aspens along the creek had turned, gold as coins, and the mornings carried a bite that lingered even after the sun climbed. Vaughn found Georgia in the storage shed, sleeves rolled, sleeves dusted with flour, inventorying sacks of meal and beans with an eye sharper than most ranchers gave a woman credit for. She didn't hear him at first, bent over a ledger, lips moving faintly as she tallied. "You're short on molasses," he said. She didn't startle. "I know. Meant to ask if one of your hands could ride to Dry Hollow. I'd like to trade for it myself, if you don't mind." "You planning to ride alone?" "Only if no one's willing to let me borrow a saddle horse and a little sense." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've got sense." "That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what is?" "Dry Hollow's not like here. There's men there who think if a woman's riding alone, she's fair to take." Georgia set the ledger down. "If I wanted to hide behind someone else's name, I never would have left Illinois." "I'm not asking you to hide," he said. "I'm asking if you'll let me come with you." Her eyes softened. "If you're offering, I'd like that." They left at first light the following morning, the wagon trailing dust as they rolled down the narrow pass that curved east through the cottonwood groves. The road was rough, carved more by hooves than wheels, and the silence between them was easy, broken now and then by the call of a hawk or the creak of harness leather. As they cleared a rise, the town came into view, a loose scatter of buildings, mostly false fronts and tin roofs, leaning like old men too long in the sun. A freight team clattered past, the driver nodding once before turning down a side lane. 3 boys chased a stray dog through the alley behind the livery. "I'll handle the molasses," Georgia said, stepping down. "You check on oats, flour, whatever else we might need. Meet me back here in an hour." Vaughn nodded. "Be careful." She walked into the mercantile with her chin high and her shoulders square. Inside, it smelled of kerosene and tobacco, and the clerk behind the counter barely looked up. "What can I get you, miss?" 2 jugs of molasses, and a pound each of salt and cloves. He fetched the jugs without a word, but as he set them down, his gaze lingered too long. "You new around here?" "Just passing through." "Shame." He leaned on the counter, grinned slow. "We don't get many women with eyes like yours." "That's so?" "Sure is. Maybe you'd let me buy you a drink after closing." "I'd rather drink creek water, thanks." His smile faltered. "You got a husband waiting outside?" "No," she slid the coin across the counter. "But I've got a man with a Winchester, and he's not fond of small talk." When she stepped outside, Vaughn was standing beside the wagon, a bolt of canvas under one arm. He raised a brow as she approached. "Clerk give you trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." They rode out without looking back, the town shrinking behind them into dust and chimney smoke. By the time they reached the ranch, the wind had shifted again, colder now. Clouds hung low against the peaks, promising snow before long. Vaughn carried the supplies into the storehouse while Georgia unhitched the team, her fingers stiff from the cold. As she latched the barn door, she glanced across the yard. Vaughn was walking toward the house, one hand on his lower back, favoring it slightly. "You hurt something?" she asked, falling into step beside him. "Old break. Took a fall branding season before last. Some days it reminds me it's still there." She hesitated, then reached for his arm. "Come inside. Let me wrap it." He didn't argue. Inside the kitchen, she heated water and tore a strip from an old sackcloth. He sat on the stool, shirt pulled aside as she worked the warm cloth over the spot just above his hip. The skin there was marked by a long, faded scar, the kind that told of pain endured without complaint. "Why didn't you let someone else do the lifting?" she asked. "Because I trust my own hands more than most. You don't have to carry everything yourself." His voice was low. "Not just talking about sacks, are you?" She tied the cloth off gently. "No," he turned to face her then, their closeness quiet, unforced. "I've been alone a long time, Georgia. It wasn't just grief. It was easier not to want anything." She met his gaze. "I know that kind of ease. But I want this," he said. "Not because I need help, or because I feel sorry for you. I want it because when you walk into a room, the world steadies." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way it settled so solidly inside her. "I want it too," she said. "I want to wake up in a place that doesn't feel borrowed." "Then stay," he said. "Not just for the winter. Not just until the ranch gets through the next season. Stay." She didn't answer with words. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and firm, her hand resting just above the old break in his back. When she pulled away, her voice was steady. "I'm staying." Outside, frost glinted along the fence rails, and the first snowflakes began to fall soft, sure and silent. The snow held for 3 days, light but steady, and by the time the sun returned, the world had gone quiet beneath a thin white crust. The cattle were brought in closer to the home pasture, and the days shortened in earnest. Georgia found her hands reddened from the cold, but her mind sharper for it, her movements sure even in the dim, fire-lit hours before dawn. On the 4th morning, Vaughn handed her a folded paper at breakfast. His face gave nothing away. "It came with the freight wagon," he said. "Ruth wrote from Fort Keogh." Georgia wiped her fingers on her apron and took it carefully. She hadn't expected word from Ruth, not so soon, not with snow between them. But the handwriting was unmistakable, bold and slanted, the loops pressed hard into the paper. She read it silently, lips parting as her eyes moved line by line. "What is it?" Vaughn asked. "She's coming," Georgia said quietly, bringing her boy with her. Her husband passed in August snakebite near the Black Hills. She didn't say much else, just that she didn't want to winter alone. Vaughn nodded once, his brow furrowed. "How soon?" "Before the next moon, if the roads hold." He didn't question the decision. Georgia didn't expect him to. But later that day, he cleared out the small room off the back porch, stacking the firewood elsewhere and laying a fresh quilt on the narrow bed. Georgia noticed the gesture, though he didn't call attention to it. That evening, she found him in the barn, filing a notch into a bridle bit. The lantern light cast long shadows across the beams. "She's the only family I have left," Georgia said, stepping into the stall beside him. "I know. She was the one who told me to leave. Said I'd rot in that house if I stayed, same as she had. I don't want her to come out here and find me changed in a way she can't recognize." Vaughn set the file down. "You've changed," he said. "But not into someone else." She leaned against the post, arms crossed against the chill. "She'll ask questions. About you. About us. Let her ask." He looked up at her then. "I'm not ashamed of what we're building." Georgia studied him in the lamplight. "I'm not either. I've never had someone stand beside me when the questions start." He reached for her hand. "You do now." The next week passed in a blur of preparation, extra wood chopped, preserves sealed, the spare room readied. Vaughn took the wagon to the trading post once more, returning with flannel for Ruth's boy and a pair of boots Georgia hadn't asked for but needed. 2 days before the next full moon, Ruth arrived. The wagon creaked into the yard at dusk, wheels rimmed in ice, horse blowing steam. Ruth stepped down first, wrapped in a wool shawl, her face drawn from travel but her eyes sharp as ever. Behind her came a boy no older than 8, blonde curls peeking beneath his cap, his arms wrapped around a satchel. Georgia crossed the yard and wrapped her sister-in-law in a long, tight embrace. "You look stronger," Ruth said in her ear. "You look tired," Georgia replied. The boy stood still, watching Vaughn approach. Vaughn crouched without speaking and offered his hand. The boy shook it solemnly. That night, after stew and cornbread and a second helping of pie, the boy fell asleep on the rug by the hearth, one hand curled around the dog Vaughn had taken in last spring. Ruth sat with her feet tucked beneath her, eyes on the fire. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she said softly to Georgia. "I almost was," Georgia replied. "Then I met a man who saw what was left of me and didn't look away." Ruth glanced toward Vaughn, who was clearing the table, sleeves rolled, his movements easy, unhurried. "He's quiet. So am I now?" Ruth smiled faintly. "You're not what you were, Georgia. But you're better for it." Later, after Ruth and the boy had gone to bed, Georgia stood on the porch with Vaughn, watching the stars blink out from behind passing clouds. "She'll stay through the winter," Georgia said. "Maybe longer." "There's room," Vaughn said. "And she's your kin." Georgia reached for his hand. "I wasn't sure what this place would be when I came. I just knew I couldn't go on where I was." He turned toward her, his breath visible in the cold. "You didn't just come west, Georgia. You built something when you got here." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The wind had stilled, and the trees creaked faintly under their own weight. After a long moment, Vaughn said, "I've been meaning to ask you something." She looked up. "I've got a piece of land up along the ridge. Good soil, plenty of sun. I've been saving it. Thought maybe, come spring, we could build something there. Together." Georgia didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "You don't have to ask," she said. "I'm already yours." He pressed a kiss to her temple, the warmth of it steady against the cold. And beneath the wide Montana sky, with winter pressing close and spring still a promise in the bones of the land, they stood side by side, knowing they would meet every season together. The spring thaw came slow, water seeping through the seams of frozen ground, loosening the earth one layer at a time. The ridge to the north, where Vaughn had spoken of building, was beginning to green along its southern slope, though patches of snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pines. Georgia sat on the edge of the porch, a small knife in her hand, quartering seed potatoes for planting. Ruth's boy, Eli, crouched nearby, lining the cut pieces in a neat row along the edge of the crate. He'd taken to ranch life with a quiet eagerness, always watching, always listening. He'd grown sturdier over the winter. "I think this one's got 2 eyes," he said, holding up a chunk. "Then we'll get 2 plants from it," she replied. "That's good luck." He nodded, satisfied, and set it with the others. Behind them, inside the house, Ruth was humming softly while mending the cuff of Vaughn's work shirt. The stitching was small and even, her fingers steadier now than when she'd first arrived. She'd been planning to stay only through the cold months, but hadn't mentioned leaving again. Georgia hadn't asked. Vaughn came around the corner of the house carrying a draw knife and a length of peeled lodgepole pine. He nodded to Eli, then met Georgia's eyes. "You said you wanted to see the ridge again," he said. "It's clear enough now, if you're up for the ride." She wiped her hands, brushed dirt from her skirt, and stood. "Let me get my coat." The climb took the better part of an hour. The trail was drier than she'd expected, though the horses slipped now and then on loose rock. Vaughn rode slightly ahead, one hand loose on the reins, his hat pulled low against the glare. They reached the top just as the wind picked up. Georgia dismounted, boots crunching in the frost-bitten grass, and turned slowly to take in the view. From the ridge, the valley spread wide below, rivers threading through pasture land, the barn roof a faint red mark beneath the sloping hills. If we build it here, he said, you'll have sun in the morning, shade in the heat, and enough wind to keep the flies off in summer. She walked a few paces toward the edge, the air sharp in her lungs. There's room for a garden, she said. And a clothesline. I thought maybe a porch wide enough for a bench. She looked at him then. What about the winter? It'll blow hard up here. I'll cut the logs thick and chink them tight. Keep the stove going. We'll be warm. Georgia stepped closer. You say it like you already see us in it. I do. Her voice was quiet. Then I do too. He reached for her hand, rough palm folding over her fingers. We can start once the ground softens. I've got the timbers stacked already. She studied his face. And after we build it? He hesitated, then said, then we marry. Georgia nodded once. Good. They stood that way for a while, wind stirring her hair, the scent of thawed pine thick in the air. Vaughn's thumb brushed the back of her hand, slow and steady. I never thought I'd want something like this again, she said. Not after what I walked away from. You didn't walk away from it, he said. You survived it. She looked out over the land again. I want to wake up next to you. I want to raise Eli in a home that doesn't carry someone else's ghosts. I want to plant something and know I'll be there to see it grow. Then it's settled. They rode back as the sun dipped low, long shadows stretching across the pasture. When they reached the yard, Ruth stepped out to meet them, wiping her hands on her skirt. Well? She asked, eyes narrowing. Georgia slid from the saddle. We're building on the ridge. Ruth nodded once, then glanced at Vaughn. You'll take care of her? I already do. That night, Georgia sat at the table with Vaughn and Ruth and Eli, passing a dish of beans and the last of the winter apples. No one said much, but the quiet was full, not hollow. Later, after Eli had gone to bed and Ruth had returned to her mending, Georgia and Vaughn stood by the fire. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. License, he said. Picked it up from the Marshall station last week. She unfolded it slowly. You were sure I'd say yes? I was sure I'd ask, he said. Georgia smiled, the corners of her mouth softening. Let's not wait. They were married the following Sunday. Ruth stitched Georgia's dress from muslin and blue ribbon. Eli gathered pine cones and wild sage to line the fence posts. Vaughn shaved and wore a clean collar. The preacher rode in from the next town over, and the vows were said with the sound of wind in the trees and horses shifting in the yard. There was no piano, no cake, no crowd. But there was warmth and laughter and a sky so wide it seemed to hold the future in its hands. That spring they built the cabin, logs notched and raised by Vaughn, Georgia, and 2 ranch hands paid in beef and fresh bread. Eli helped carry stones for the hearth. Ruth planted hollyhocks along the south wall. By midsummer, the house stood solid on the ridge, the porch broad and shaded, the windows catching the first light of each day. Georgia hung her apron by the stove, set a kettle on the hook, and opened both doors wide. Vaughn came in from the field, dust on his boots, and crossed the room to kiss her cheek. She turned to him, her smile sure. We have a home now. He wrapped an arm around her waist. We always did. This is just wood and nails. You're the rest. And as the wind slipped through the grass and the sun fell across the hills, they stood together in that small, sturdy house, knowing they had built not just shelter, but a life. They never left the ridge. The garden grew, the child thrived, and the days, one after another, unfolded in peace. Through each season, harvest, snow, bloom, and drought, they held fast to one another. They didn't speak of forever, but lived it quietly every day.